Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Sania Farooqui Show. Today, we are going to spend the next couple of minutes discussing a few key issues covering South Asia. Human rights in this region of the world has become even more challenging, and we hope to cover as much as we can, whether it is freedom of expression, authorities using repressive laws to silence critiques by curbing freedom of expression, both offline and online, human rights defenders, including activists, journalists, students, lawyers, and actors facing intimidation and harassment. We're also seeing erosion of democratic norms, growing authoritarianism. Almost all countries in the region, from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, they all face a common trend of human rights violation and a culture of impunity. To discuss all this and more, we have with us the very amazing Priya Pillai. She's an international lawyer specializing in international justice, human rights, peace and conflict, transitional justice, and humanitarian issues. Priya has worked at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY on trials in the aftermath of the Balkans conflict, and other organizations such as Amnesty International, WHO, and the IFRC. Thank you so much, Priya. Truly wonderful to have you join us on the Sania Farooqui Show today.
My pleasure, and thank you for having me.
Thanks. So, Priya, starting with what's happening in South Asia, you've worked as an international lawyer for over 2 decades and across the world. Let me start by asking you, when it comes to human rights in South Asia, where are we at right now? This region has seen many disruptions over the past couple of years, including the global pandemic. We've seen political disruptions. We've seen floods happening over here. We've seen, what's happened in Afghanistan. We've seen what happened in Sri Lanka. So just to get a sense, what would be the key issues that need attention when it comes to the current state of South Asia?
Thanks for that, Sania. I mean, that's a very complex question with multiple answers, but I'll try to give you a bit of a nutshell of how I perceive things. Quite honestly, human rights across South Asia, we're not in a good place at all. We've got multiple complex contexts across the region in different countries as well. We've got legacies of internal armed conflict, Sri Lanka and Nepal. We've got financial economic crisis in Sri Lanka, Pakistan as well. We've got impacts of climate change, which we've seen play out in Pakistan and India. We've got COVID, which has affected the entire region quite adversely. So we've got a lot of different issues and context, social, economic, political contexts within this region itself. I think in terms of specific issues that we need to address, quite frankly, I think economic, social, cultural rights, if you put it in the context of international law, the impact of COVID in terms of equitable health outcomes, access to vaccines, medication, access to resources, basically. So I think economic, social, cultural rights are one category that we need to take very seriously as well, especially having seen what's happened with COVID-19 in the last 2-3 years. And then, of course, civil and political rights. We've got rising intolerance, we've got hate speech, we've got attacks against minorities in countries across the region. There are issues around access to justice. There's impunity more broadly speaking and across the region. And as well as, not to say this is the last, but this is really important, gender and women's rights. So I think just in a nutshell, those are the issues that we're grappling with across this region.
Very quickly, I want to touch upon what's happening in Afghanistan. The Taliban rule has had a devastating impact on the lives of Afghan women, girls, journalists, and human rights defenders. This crisis seems to be escalating with no end in sight. What needs to be done right now? Are international communities, organizations, even countries with strategic interest failing to take a stand against the Taliban and what they're doing to the girls, or what they're doing to the country in its broader sense, as we're seeing a huge attack on all aspects in the country right now?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm glad we've started with Afghanistan as well. I mean, what is happening there is absolutely unconscionable. We're talking about an entire generation and half the population that is being deprived of their basic rights to dignity, to education, really their right to life as well. So it's a very frightening phase, I think, in the deprivation of rights in the country, and specifically a category of the population, 50% that is being forced to stay home, that is being forced against their will to adhere to Taliban diktats, which most of them do not agree with. So I think it's a really frightening situation right now. I think in terms of what needs to be done, clearly greater pressure on the Taliban, whether this is by targeted sanctions against specific members of the regime, whether it's by economic pressure. I think there needs to be a much more concerted effort and a coalition of all countries saying that this is not acceptable and that there will be consequences, and also regional pressure. This is we're talking about the region which has neighbors which can influence what is happening in Afghanistan as well. So I think that is definitely, in terms of the geopolitical situation, that needs to happen. I think specifically on the legal issues, there have been calls by multiple organizations for an accountability mechanism. The recent Human Rights Council has just met, the 51st HRC, and many organizations have said, look, what is happening is not enough. There is a special rapporteur with a mandate on Afghanistan, but there also needs to be an accountability mechanism, perhaps something similar to what has been set up for Myanmar and Syria, that will actually collect evidence, that will actually, hold people to account subsequently. Because by all accounts, there are multiple crimes against international law that are occurring, especially against women and girls, but also, let's not forget, against ethnic and religious minorities, against journalists, against human rights defenders. So, there needs to be either a mandate as well as an accountability mechanism, really for us to see something of consequence in terms of accountability. And I'll just end on Afghanistan by saying, on 12th August 2022, exactly a year after the takeover of Afghanistan, independent experts issued a statement, and this includes the UN rapporteur on Afghanistan, who basically said that nowhere in the world has there been as widespread, systematic, and all-encompassing an attack on the rights of women and girls. So a really somber statement, but I think something that we all need to take really seriously and ensure that there are consequences and accountability for this.
Yeah, which is gravely worrying as well. Coming to Pakistan, we are going to be talking about the impact of the recent devastating floods, political disruptions, economic and financial crisis. But we cannot go without mentioning freedom of expression, with journalists and human rights defenders coming under increased scrutiny, harsh punishment, lack of accountability for enforced disappearances, forced evictions and blasphemy laws, and the recent, the finding that there was a journalist who was killed, again from Pakistan. What are your comments? Do you think we'll see any changes in the future? Is there any hope for any sort of changes or improvement in the country, given it's going through massive political turmoil? If you don't have stability in place, how do you run the country? Then, questions are, what is the future?
I think just a broad sort of caveat. I'm generally an optimistic person. I think being in the space that I'm in, I think there's always hope, and that's what we work towards, right? So I think human rights defenders, journalists, it's always calling part to account and sort of with the view of a better future, I think. So I think that's, paramount. And I know that there are incredible human rights defenders and journalists in Pakistan who are really working towards that as well. I can't speculate too much on the political situation, not knowing enough. But what I will say is, I think the first thing I would like to highlight are the devastating floods that have covered, 1/3 of the country. And I think a reminder for all of us, even in the human rights space, that climate change is there and it's real, and it has devastating impacts now that the climate catastrophe is sort of playing out across the region. And we can see that. And it has an impact on human rights of the poor, livelihoods, a range of issues that we need to take into account. I think in terms of more broadly, I think the way I do see it is that there's a tussle between, democratic ideals as well as sort of authoritarianism, and in particular evidenced by the role of the army in political life in Pakistan. And I think this has, ensuing results such as violations of human rights, including extrajudicial killings, detentions, disappearances. On one or two of the legal issues, many years ago, actually 2011, there was a commission of inquiry on enforced disappearances that was set up in Pakistan. This has been seen as a failure because it did not result in accountability or did not result in reparations for victims as well. The other issue, of course, is the Human Rights Committee and the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief have basically recommended that Pakistan should repeal or amend its so-called blasphemy laws. But keep in mind that in 2014, there was a landmark judgment by the Pakistan Supreme Court, which actually expanded and clarified the scope of the right to freedom of religion or belief. The issue is that some of this is not implemented. So you've got civil society, you've got lawyers, you've got journalists, you've got human rights defenders that are really pushing and working hard within Pakistan to ensure that civic space is opened up and that a lot of these past violations and ongoing violations are people are held accountable as well. But it's hard. It's not an easy job.
And coming to the neighbor, India, in 2021, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government in India was downgraded from a free democracy to a partially free democracy and was also called electoral autocracy. We are also seeing an increase in attacks on minorities, particularly Muslims and Dalits in the country, ongoing harassments of journalists, activists, human rights defenders, and even actors. How concerning is it to see where India is headed? Are we on our way towards losing our democratic value and sense of unity? Is it going to become worse? What is your sense about India?
I mean, this is of course personal as well, right? And I've moved back to India after many years, and it's really been sort of a process of seeing where things are at in the country. I think it's different being outside as well. What I would say is, I as I said before, I always feel that there is hope. And that's something that we all have to work towards. But what is happening is very concerning. It is extremely concerning. I think rights that perhaps some of us had taken somewhat for granted are being eroded every day. And the sense of a plural, vibrant democracy is also definitely being eroded, I think, in the eyes of the world in general, but also internally within the country. I think, specifically the rise of hate speech and vitriol against minorities, accompanied by the jailing of human rights defenders, journalists who are of a different political view or political persuasion as well, is extremely worrying. And I think we need to look at all these factors in conjunction, not as isolated incidents, but to look at it as a whole and sort of make us an assessment of where we are. And it is extremely worrying. I mean, there's been an erosion of rule of law and human rights in India, which is, which has consequences, which has serious consequences on individuals, but also serious consequences on our institutions. And I think that's something that, again, we need to be really mindful of. I think in terms of specific legal issues that I would highlight, I would say persecution of journalists and anyone dissenting. As we've seen, people are languishing in jail, sort of seen as political prisoners. We've got a reduction of civic space in terms of organizing or organized civic space by laws such as the FCRA, the Foreign Contribution Regulations Act, as well as other repressive laws. And I think the other issue that we need to also take into account very seriously is also the misuse of anti-terrorism laws, and that is again being used as a tool to quash dissent and to ensure that there are no voices that speak up in opposition as well. So very concerning overall. But again, a number of human rights defenders and journalists are putting themselves on the line really. And I do think that there is hope for the future, but it's going to be a lot of work and sort of claiming space back and sort of moving forward again, making up for all that we've lost. So it's going to be a hard journey.
Coming to Sri Lanka has seen massive disruptions, and the country is just about trying to survive what happened recently with the government losing power. But there were concerns regarding its treatment of minorities and all other forms of human rights violations, including its crackdown on civil society activists and human rights defenders. What would you say moving forward Sri Lanka needs to keep in mind, and what are the dangers for the country, given it's already very in a state of turmoil and quite unstable at the moment?
I think we've all seen what's played out in Sri Lanka in the last few months, really with a sense of real sadness and shock in terms of, how the situation has spiraled out of control as well. And of course, stability and governance is the need of the hour. But what I would also say is, we can't ignore the past and the multiple complex reasons for the present situation. Of course, there's economics, there's financial issues, there are a range of other issues as well. But I think, what I would highlight is also a reckoning with the past and the fact that we've got political dynasties that have been there that have not been held to account, and there's been no reckoning for the civil war as well. So there's really been impunity, which has failed to address what has happened in the country. And I think that is definitely a part of this entire matrix that we need to look at. I think in terms of the current situation right now, I know that there have been discussions around a sort of broad-based consultative process on constitutional reforms, but that has not really happened. Also, there are declarations on states of emergency, which affect freedom of association, which affect peaceful assembly. And that's really a problem. And I think linked to that also is, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which is also being weaponized and used against journalists and human rights defenders who are critical and who are speaking out in Sri Lanka, very effectively. I think in terms of looking at the past as well, if you recall, 2015, there was resolution 30/1 by the Human Rights Council, which really put the onus, and Sri Lanka said, look, we will step up and we will address what has happened in the past. We will ensure there's accountability. Nothing has really happened on that. In March 2021, there was a resolution 46/1 in March, which talked about the UN Accountability Project to collect and prepare evidence for international crimes that were committed in Sri Lanka. So, there's been a bit of a gap in terms of what should have happened in terms of the transitional justice processes. And I think now really the question is, with this current chaos and turmoil, what happens with that? And I think there's still a need to double down and ensure that that does happen. And I think I'll just sort of mention that in September, before the Commissioner on Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, stepped down, she did release a report, a really wide-ranging report on Sri Lanka and on the situation of human rights, which I think would be very, would be worth going through as well, because it does have very concrete recommendations. But in essence, I think there's a need to ensure that the government is held to account and it does proceed with the transitional justice mechanisms that it had promised, and that are legal obligations as well for them to undertake.
Yeah. Coming to Nepal, Nepal has been under the human rights violation radar for issues including unlawful or arbitrary killings, including extrajudicial killings by the government, arbitrary detentions, serious restrictions on freedom of expression, media, restrictive laws, particularly on organizations and funding and operations of NGOs. And that is something we see very common across South Asia, the civil society organizations and restrictions on freedom of movement for refugees as well, particularly resident Tibetans, and many reports of gender-based violence. Give us a little insight, because Nepal rarely makes it in, there's a lot that's happening in the country, but we rarely see the news coming up about all the violations the country sort of just behind the scenes performs. But just a little insight on why Nepal fails to stand up for human rights violation.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I think, it's really important for us to look at Nepal, again, to say that there's a long and complex history of civil war and internal armed conflict, and the legacy is still being felt today. So again, a bit like Sri Lanka, Nepal did have, did promise to put in place what are called transitional justice processes. So questions of accountability, reparations for victims, ways of redressing the enforced disappearances, the entire range or the gamut of human rights violations that took place during the civil war. Now, the 2006 Comprehensive Peace Agreement did put in place these commitments that the government and non-state actors, armed groups were meant to comply with. Just recently, in fact, you will have seen, I think in July, August of this year, the outgoing government has presented a bill which is on the transitional justice processes. Of course, we have elections coming up in November, and so now we need to see where this bill goes. But the consensus seems to be from most civil society organizations that within the bill, there are things that can be worked with, but there are amendments and changes that need to take place in this bill before it becomes law. And I think just to recall that, there have been two transitional justice commissions also in Nepal, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Commission on Investigation of Enforced Disappearances. These were all set up in 2015 under the previous law, which was seen as quite flawed, and was actually struck down by the Supreme Court, but it's still in place. So we've got this legacy of a sort of hodgepodge of legal initiatives, which now it feels like sort of coming back to the drawing board all over again. And I think just in terms of, enforced disappearances, EJKs, extrajudicial killings, there have been many families, I think more than 150 families that have been trying to get justice through the regular court system. And this has not really worked because, the approach has been all these conflict era cases need to go through the transitional justice process, which also has not worked. So I think it's sort of a bit of wait and watch now to see what happens in the elections and what happens with this new bill and what can be salvaged and how it moves forward.
Yeah. I'm going to quickly ask you about Bangladesh, which is the last country that we're going to be focusing on. Bangladesh is central to many issues in South Asia, as we discussed, whether enforced disappearances, abductions, torture, and extrajudicial killings by its security forces with impunity. And of course, we cannot talk about Bangladesh without talking about the Rohingya crisis. Do you think Bangladesh is doing enough, or has it learned its lessons in the past, from, to pay more attention to its human rights violation? And is it doing enough to help the Rohingyas? And do you have any concerns about Bhashan Char? Because that is an ongoing conversation when it comes to the refugee crisis and to the region itself. Because if that does take place, if the movement does happen, it's going to be it'll have a huge impact in South Asia.
No, and I'm glad sort of we've brought up Bangladesh as well. And I think specifically on the refugee issues, right, linked to the Rohingya, I think one issue, which is a bigger issue for South Asia in general, but, Bangladesh does, since we're talking about refugees right now, is the fact that most countries in South Asia actually have not signed up to the Refugee Convention. And, so it's sort of an ad hoc approach and an ad hoc basis, in terms of their approach. And this includes countries across the region. I think in terms of Bangladesh specifically, to be honest, I think, linked to the Rohingya influx in 2017, they've done a lot. It's not easy. In the space of a few weeks, you had close to 1 million people desperately crossing the border, seeking refuge, seeking shelter, and Bangladesh opened its doors. So I think their initial approach and the initial reaction, a very humanitarian reaction, is really to be applauded and is to be commended. Having said that, there are also limitations. Bangladesh is not a rich country. It is also has its own challenges as well. And so I think it is sort of seeing the need for more support from the international community. And I see that there's a frustration building up, from the perspective of the government, but also internally within Bangladesh, saying, look, we also need help in dealing with this crisis, and we're really not getting enough support. So I think, but having said that, what I would also say is in terms of within the camp and Cox's Bazar and the refugee camps, the approach needs to be also one of sort of allowing refugees, livelihood, education, all these other things which are necessities really, and sort of that's not happening, at a concerted level. So I think there are a lot of issues linked to the situation of the Rohingya right now and what happens. I think things are becoming quite critical given the situation in Myanmar. I think the government of Bangladesh wants to repatriate people, but of course with an armed conflict, raging in the country, that's also not really an option, definitely not an option. So I think, yeah, it is complicated. I think in terms of Bhashan Char, I think the intention probably is correct, and the fact that they are trying to make space and trying to set up appropriate shelters for the refugees, but the fact is that there are serious concerns about Bhashan Char in terms of its proclivity to flooding and to typhoons and storms. So there are a lot of issues. I know that people are sort of in a wait and see mode, and they want to go and see Bhashan Char before sort of pronouncing whether it would work or not. But whatever it is, refugees, if they are moved, need to be moved on the basis of voluntariness, on free consent. Nobody should be forced. And I think that's really the bottom line as well.
All right. Thank you, Priya. On that note, we're going to wrap up because we've just about, wrapped this interview on time. So thank you so much. Truly wonderful to have you on the Sania Farooqui Show. And I'm so glad we finally made it, given our own personal chaos going on, the pandemic and the lockdown.
Yeah.
Even though we're not living in a lockdown, we're still coming out of it in a very strange manner. So thank you so much. I'm truly, wonderful to have you here today.
My pleasure, and thank you for having me. And it's really been a pleasure to finally meet you in quotes in real life, as COVID has sort of put us in this situation, and hope to meet you off Zoom as well at some point.
Yes, likewise. Thank you. And for those of you
Thanks, Sania.
tuned in, thank you so much for watching. I hope you'll subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I will come again next week, so stay tuned.